In the bitter cold of a frontier saloon, a desperate father publicly auctioned his own daughters to pay his debts. When a silent, scarred rancher stepped forward and chose the one everyone mocked, the daughter treated as worthless her entire life, the room fell into stunned silence. With one deliberate act, he wrapped her in his coat and walked her past years of shame. What seemed like charity became something far more powerful, a declaration that she had worth. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let's begin. The saloon doors swung open with a violence that matched the wind howling outside. Snow blew across the threshold in white, chaotic gusts as Jacob Brennan stumbled inside, his coat torn at the shoulder, his face the color of ash. Behind him, two men in fine wool overcoats followed, creditors by the look of them. Men who didn't belong in a place like this. The conversations died one by one. Every head turned. Jacob's hands shook as he pulled off his hat, and not from the cold. His eyes swept the room, past the card tables, past the bar where old miners nursed their whiskey, past the women in faded calico dresses who served them. He was looking for something or someone. "Where are they?" one of the creditors asked, his voice clipped and impatient. "Eastern, probably from Denver or further." "Upstairs," Jacob muttered. "I'll get them." He moved toward the narrow staircase at the back of the room, and the crowd parted for him the way it might for a leper. Nobody wanted to touch whatever shame he was carrying. Sarah Brennan heard the boots on the stairs before she heard the voices. She was sitting on the edge of a sagging bed in a room that smelled of old smoke and mildew, mending a tear in her sister's shawl by candlelight. Across from her, Grace sat at the cracked mirror, pinning up her blonde hair with the kind of practiced precision that came from years of being told she was the pretty one. "Something's wrong," Sarah said quietly. Grace didn't look away from her reflection. "Something's always wrong with him." The door flew open without a knock. Their father stood there, breathing hard, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. "Get up, both of you." Grace turned slowly, her expression wary. "What's happening?" "You're coming downstairs." Sarah set the shawl aside and rose to her feet. She was taller than Grace, broader in the shoulders, with dark hair that refused to hold a curl and a face that had been called plain so many times she'd stopped arguing. "Why?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "Because I said so." "That's not an answer," Sarah pressed. "It's the only one you're getting." He pointed toward the hallway. "Move." Grace stood, smoothing her skirts. She had a way of carrying herself that made even a threadbare dress look deliberate. Sarah envied that about her, though she'd never say it aloud. Grace glanced at her, and for just a moment something like fear flickered in her blue eyes. They descended the stairs together, Sarah's hand brushing the rough wooden banister. The saloon had gone quiet again. Every face was turned toward them now, watching with the kind of morbid curiosity people reserved for public hangings. At the bottom of the steps, the two creditors stood waiting. One of them, tall, angular, with a thin mustache, held a leather ledger in his hands. The other, shorter and heavier, wore a gold watch chain across his vest. Jacob gestured toward his daughters, like a man presenting livestock. "These are them." The tall man opened the ledger, flipping through pages filled with cramped handwriting. "Jacob Brennan. Outstanding debts totaling $470. Contracts signed, payments missed." He looked up. "You were given extensions. Multiple extensions." "I know," Jacob said hoarsely. "I know what I owe." "Then you understand we're here to collect." "I don't have it." The shorter man smiled, though there was no humor in it. "We're aware." Sarah's stomach turned to lead. She looked at her father, at the way his shoulders sagged, the way his hands hung limp at his sides. He wasn't going to fight. He'd already given up. "What's happening?" Grace whispered. The tall man closed the ledger with a soft thud. "Your father owes money he cannot pay. Therefore, we are seizing assets." "We don't have assets," Sarah said flatly. "Look around. This isn't ours. We rent a room." "Not property," the man corrected. "Prospects." The word hung in the air like a noose. Grace's face went pale. "No." "Marriage contracts," the shorter man said, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. Binding agreements. Your father signs over guardianship, and suitable arrangements are made. The debts are cleared. That's... Sarah's voice cracked. That's selling us. That's business, the tall man replied coolly. Jacob wouldn't meet their eyes. He stared at the floor, his jaw working soundlessly. You can't do this, Grace said, her voice rising. You can't just... It's already done, Jacob interrupted. I signed the papers this morning. The room erupted. Voices overlapped. Shock, outrage, fascination. Some of the men laughed. A few of the women looked away, their faces tight with pity or disgust. Grace started to cry, soft, choked sobs that she tried to swallow. Sarah didn't cry. She felt something colder settle over her, something sharp and clarifying. This was what her father had always been. She'd known it for years. She just hadn't expected him to make it official. Who? She asked. Her voice cut through the noise. Who did you promise us to? The tall man consulted his ledger. There are interested parties. We'll hear offers. Offers, Sarah repeated. The word tasted like bile. Stand there, the shorter man instructed, pointing to a spot near the bar. Let them see you properly. Grace flinched as if she'd been struck, but she moved. Sarah followed, her hands clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palms. They stood side by side beneath the flicker of oil lamps, and the room studied them the way men might study horses at auction. Grace Brennan, the tall man announced. 18 years old, accomplished seamstress, literate, well-mannered. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Men leaned forward. A rancher near the back straightened his hat. Another man, older, with a silver beard, nodded appreciatively. Then the man turned to Sarah. Sarah Brennan, 22 years old. He paused, glancing at the ledger again, as if hoping for more. Strong, capable, with livestock and field work. Silence. Nobody leaned forward, nobody nodded. A few men smirked. One muttered something to his companion, and they both laughed. Sarah kept her chin up, her expression blank. She'd heard worse. She'd been hearing worse her entire life. We'll start with Grace, the shorter man said smoothly. Opening consideration. $100, an assumption of 1/3 debt. Hands went up immediately. The rancher, the man with the silver beard, a merchant Sarah vaguely recognized from town. Grace's breath hitched. 120, the rancher called. 150, countered the merchant. The bidding climbed steadily, methodically. Grace stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, and Sarah wanted to reach for her hand but couldn't make herself move. Any gesture of comfort would shatter what little composure she had left. Finally, at $210, the rancher won. He approached with his hat in his hands, his expression something close to bashful. I'll treat her right, miss, he said to Grace, as if that made any of this acceptable. Grace didn't answer. She looked at Sarah, her eyes wide and desperate, and Sarah forced herself to nod. Go. It's done. The tall man made a note in his ledger. That leaves Sarah Brennan, opening consideration, $50, an assumption of remaining debt. $50. For Grace, they'd started at $100. Sarah swallowed the humiliation like ground glass. No hands went up. The shorter man frowned. $50, gentlemen, and she's strong, good for work. A man near the bar snorted. I got mules that cost less and complain half as much. Laughter rolled through the room. Sarah's vision blurred at the edges, but she kept her face still. She would not give them the satisfaction. 40, the tall man tried. Nothing. 30. A long, excruciating silence. Grace was sobbing openly now, and the rancher was leading her toward the door. She looked back over her shoulder, mouthing something Sarah couldn't make out. $25, the shorter man said, his voice tight with frustration. Final offer. The door opened. Cold air rushed in, and with it came a man Sarah had seen only a handful of times in her life. He was tall, taller than anyone in the room, with shoulders that filled the doorway and a face carved from hard years and harder choices. His coat was patched leather and worn wool, his hat pulled low, and a scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pale and jagged against weathered skin. Silas Kane. He lived alone in the high country, miles from town, and came down only when he needed supplies. People said he'd been a trapper once. Others said he'd lost a family in a fire. Nobody knew for sure, and nobody asked. He wasn't the kind of man you questioned. He stepped inside, snow dusting his shoulders, and the room seemed to shrink around him. His eyes swept the scene, the creditors, Jacob, Sarah standing alone near the bar. He didn't speak. He just looked. The tall man cleared his throat. "Mr. Kane, we're conducting business here." Silas's gaze shifted to him. "I can see that. We're offering the young woman for marriage contract, $25 and debt assumption." Silas looked at Sarah. She met his eyes, and for the first time that night, she felt something other than shame. She didn't know what it was. Maybe anger, maybe defiance, maybe just exhaustion. He studied her for a long moment, and then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He tossed it onto the bar. It landed with a heavy clink. "50," he said. The room went silent. The shorter man blinked. "I'm sorry?" $50, Silas repeated, "and I'll cover the full debt." Jacob's head snapped up. "The full—" $470, Silas said flatly. "I'll pay it." The creditors exchanged glances. The tall man opened the pouch, counted the coins inside, and his expression shifted from skepticism to astonishment. "This is—" He cleared his throat. "This is more than sufficient." Silas stepped forward, and the crowd parted for him the way it had for Jacob earlier, but for entirely different reasons. He stopped in front of Sarah, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "You have a choice," he said quietly. "You can stay here with him." He nodded toward Jacob. "Or you can come with me." Sarah's throat tightened. "Why?" "Because nobody should be sold like cattle." That's not an answer. His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "It's the only one I've got." She looked past him, at her father, who still wouldn't meet her eyes, at the creditors already counting their money, at the townspeople watching with gleeful fascination. Then she looked back at Silas Kane. "All right," she said. He nodded once, then turned and walked to the bar. He pulled off his heavy coat, thick wool lined with fur, and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm, far warmer than anything she'd ever worn, and it smelled like wood smoke and pine. "Let's go," he said. Sarah pulled the coat tighter around herself and followed him toward the door. Behind her, the tall man was already drawing up papers. Jacob was signing them, his hand shaking. Grace was gone. As Sarah reached the threshold, someone called out, "Good luck, Kane! You're going to need it with that one!" Laughter followed. Silas didn't stop, didn't turn. He just pushed the door open and stepped into the storm. Sarah followed. The wind hit her like a fist, but the coat held. Snow swirled around them, thick and blinding, as Silas led her toward a wagon hitched at the edge of the street. He helped her up without a word, then climbed onto the seat beside her and took the reins. The wagon lurched forward. Sarah looked back once, at the glowing windows of the saloon, at the town that had never wanted her. Then she turned forward, into the dark, into the unknown. Silas didn't speak. Neither did she. The storm swallowed them whole. The ride took hours. Sarah lost track of time somewhere between the second ridge and the third. The world became nothing but white. Snow above, snow below, snow filling every gap in the air. The wagon creaked and jolted over frozen ruts, and the cold bit through even the thick coat Silas had given her. He drove in silence, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat, his hands steady on the reins. Occasionally he'd glance at her, as if checking to make sure she hadn't frozen solid, but he never spoke. Sarah didn't mind. She didn't trust her voice yet. When the cabin finally came into view, it was less a structure and more a shadow against the mountainside. Low, sturdy, built from logs and stone, with smoke rising from a chimney that jutted crookedly from the roof. A barn stood nearby, and beyond that a fenced pasture where a few horses huddled together against the wind. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He offered his hand, and Sarah took it, her legs stiff and unsteady as she stepped into the snow. "This way," he said. He led her to the door, pushed it open, and gestured for her to enter. The interior was warmer than she'd expected. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting flickering light across rough-hewn furniture. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall. Furs were piled in one corner. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with tools, dried herbs, and tin cans. It smelled like leather and smoke and something faintly medicinal. Silas closed the door behind them and set his hat on a peg. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the fire. Sarah moved to the hearth and sank onto a wooden stool, her hands shaking as she held them toward the flames. The coat slipped from her shoulders, pooling around her waist. Silas poured water from a kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink." She did. It was lukewarm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was wet, and that was enough. He stood across from her, leaning against the table, his arms crossed. "You'll sleep there." He pointed to the bed. "I'll take the floor." Sarah stared at him. "This is your home. And you're a guest." She stopped, unsure how to finish. "I'm payment for my father's debts. I'm a burden. I'm nothing." "You're tired," Silas said simply. "Rest." He turned and began pulling furs from the corner, spreading them near the fire. Sarah watched him, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This man, this stranger, had paid more for her than anyone in that room thought she was worth. He'd brought her to his home, he'd given her his coat, his bed, and he'd asked for nothing. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Silas didn't look up. "Do what?" "Pay for me. Bring me here." He paused, his hands resting on the furs. "Because I've seen what happens to women who stay in places like that, and I've got space." "That's all?" "That's all." It wasn't. She could tell, but she didn't press. "Thank you," she said quietly. He glanced at her then, and for just a moment, something softened in his expression. "Get some sleep, Sarah." She rose and moved to the bed, still wrapped in his coat. She lay down without undressing, pulling a worn quilt over herself, and closed her eyes. Behind her, the fire crackled. Silas settled onto the furs without another word, and for the first time in years, Sarah Brennan fell asleep without fear. She woke to the smell of coffee. Pale light filtered through the single window, turning the cabin gray and soft. Sarah sat up slowly, disoriented, her body aching from the cold and the long ride. The bed creaked beneath her. Silas was at the table, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He didn't look at her. "Morning." "Morning," she echoed, her voice rough. He set 1 cup on the table and took the other to the fire. "There's bread in the basket. Help yourself." Sarah rose, folding the quilt carefully, and moved to the table. The bread was dense and dark, the kind that lasted through winter. She broke off a piece and ate it slowly, washing it down with the bitter coffee. Silas stood by the fire, staring into the flames. He'd changed his shirt, this one cleaner, though still patched at the elbows. His scar caught the light, pale and stark. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "You tell me." She frowned. "You paid for a marriage contract." "I paid to get you out of that room," Silas corrected. "What happens next is up to you." "I don't understand." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You want to stay here? You can. You want to leave? I'll take you to the next town when the snow clears. You want to write to someone? I'll see the letter get sent." He paused. "But you're not property. Not here." Sarah's throat tightened. "I have nowhere else to go." "Then stay." "And do what?" "Whatever you want." He gestured toward the door. "There's work if you're interested. Animals need tending. Firewood needs splitting. I'm not asking you to earn your keep, but I'm not stopping you if you choose to." She studied him, searching for the trick, the expectation, the demand that always came eventually. But his face gave nothing away. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay." Silas nodded. "Good." He drained his coffee, set the cup on the table, and pulled on his coat. "I'm checking the traps. I'll be back before dark." "Can I come?" He paused at the door, hand on the latch. "You want to?" "I'd rather move than sit." Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. "Dress warm." The mountains were brutal in winter. Sarah had grown up in frontier towns, had known cold and hardship, but this was different. This was isolation made solid, A world stripped down to snow and stone and survival. Silas moved through it with the ease of someone who'd long ago stopped fighting the land and learned to live within it. He showed her the trapline, a series of snares and deadfalls set along a frozen creek. He checked each one methodically, resetting those that had been tripped, collecting the ones that had caught something. A rabbit. A marten. He worked with efficiency, no wasted movement. Sarah watched, then helped. She held the sack while he worked. She learned to reset a snare without cutting her fingers on the wire. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and Silas seemed to prefer it that way. On the walk back, she stumbled over a hidden root and went down hard, catching herself on her hands. Snow soaked through her gloves. Silas stopped and looked back. "You hurt?" "No." She pushed herself up, brushing snow from her coat. He waited until she caught up, then kept walking. That was all. No lecture, no impatience, just patience. When they returned to the cabin, Sarah helped him skin the rabbit. He showed her how to make the cut clean, how to peel the hide without tearing it. Her hands shook at first. From cold or nerves, she wasn't sure, but she managed. "You've done this before," Silas observed. "A little. My mother used to—" She stopped. He didn't press. They worked in silence, and when the rabbit was dressed and hung, Silas washed his hands in a basin of cold water. "You did good today." Sarah blinked. "I didn't do much." "You kept up. You didn't complain. That's more than most." He dried his hands on a rag. "Get warm. I'll start supper." She moved to the fire, sinking onto the stool, and watched as he worked. He cooked the way he did everything else, efficiently, methodically. Cornmeal mush with salt pork, simple, filling. They ate together at the table, and for the first time Sarah felt something like calm settle over her. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Silas looked up from his plate. "Go ahead." "Why do you live up here? Alone?" He was quiet for a long moment, chewing slowly. "Because it's easier." "Easier than what?" "Than people." She understood that, more than he probably realized. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked. "Sometimes." He set down his spoon. "But lonely's better than cruel." Sarah looked down at her plate, her chest tight. "Yes," she said softly. "It is." They finished eating in silence. That night, as Sarah lay in the narrow bed and Silas settled onto his furs by the fire, she stared at the ceiling and wondered what kind of man paid a fortune for a stranger's freedom and asked for nothing in return. She didn't have an answer. But for the first time in her life, she thought maybe she didn't need one. The days fell into a rhythm. Silas rose before dawn, built up the fire, and made coffee. Sarah woke to the sound of him moving through the cabin, boots on wood, the scrape of the kettle, the soft creak of the door as he stepped outside to check the weather. She learned his routine quickly. Mornings were for the animals, feeding the horses, checking the small flock of chickens that huddled in a coop behind the barn, hauling water from the creek when it wasn't frozen solid. Afternoons were for work, mending tack, chopping wood, checking traps. Evenings were for stillness. Silas didn't talk much, but he didn't need to. His silence wasn't hostile. It was simply the quiet of a man who'd spent years alone and had forgotten how to fill space with words. Sarah didn't mind. She'd spent her whole life surrounded by noise, her father's anger, her sister's tears, the constant hum of judgment in every town they'd passed through. The silence here felt like mercy. She worked without being asked. Splitting kindling, mending a tear in one of the furs, kneading dough for bread when the flour ran low. Silas never thanked her, but he noticed. She could tell by the way he'd pause when he saw what she'd done, the faint nod of approval before he moved on. One afternoon, she found a broom in the corner, worn bristles, handle smoothed by years of use, and swept the cabin floor. Dust and ash gathered in small piles, evidence of months, maybe years of neglect. When Silas came back inside, he stopped in the doorway and looked around. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I wanted to." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Looks better." It was the closest thing to praise she'd heard from him. That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Silas carved a piece of wood with a small knife, shaving thin curls into a pile at his feet. Sarah watched the firelight play across his scarred face, the way his hands moved with careful precision. "What are you making?" she asked. Spoon. You already have spoons. One more won't hurt, she smiled faintly. No, I suppose it won't. He glanced at her, and for just a second, his mouth twitched, almost a smile. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them, and Sarah realized something startling. She wasn't afraid here. Not of Silas. Not of the future, not even of herself. For the first time in her life, she felt like she could breathe. 2 weeks into her stay, the weather broke. The snow stopped, the sky cleared, and pale sunlight spilled across the mountains like something fragile and new. Silas stood outside the cabin, looking south toward the distant line of trees that marked the edge of his land. Sarah joined him, pulling his coat, her coat now, he'd insisted she keep it, tighter around her shoulders. Someone's coming, Silas said quietly. She followed his gaze and saw it, a dark shape moving through the snow, still distant but growing closer. Her stomach tightened. Who? Don't know. They waited. The figure resolved into a man on horseback, older with a graying beard and a heavy coat. He rode slowly, carefully, and when he reached the cabin, he dismounted with a grunt. Silas, the man said, nodding. Ben. Silas's voice was neutral. What brings you up here? Ben glanced at Sarah, his expression curious but not unkind. Heard you took in Jacob Brennan's daughter. Word travels fast. Always does. Ben shifted his weight. Thought I'd check in, make sure everything's all right. Everything's fine. Ben looked at Sarah again. That true, miss? Sarah met his eyes. Yes. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Good. He turned back to Silas. There's talk in town. People saying you bought yourself a wife. People talk about a lot of things. They're saying she's difficult. Silas's jaw tightened. She's standing right here, Ben. You got something to say. Say it to her. Ben had the grace to look embarrassed. No offense meant, miss. None taken, Sarah said evenly. But I'm not difficult. I'm just not decorative. Ben blinked, then laughed, a short, surprised bark of sound. Fair enough. He looked at Silas. You need anything? We're good. All right then. Ben climbed back onto his horse. You change your mind. You know where to find me. He rode off, and Silas stood watching until he disappeared into the trees. Friend of yours? Sarah asked. Close enough. Silas turned back toward the cabin. He's a good man. Checks on me when the winter gets long. What did he mean about talk in town? Silas paused at the door. People like to make stories out of things they don't understand. And what's the story they're making about us? He looked at her, his expression hard to read. That I bought a wife I'll regret. That you're unmarriageable. That this won't last the winter. Sarah felt the old shame rise in her chest, hot and bitter. And what do you think? I think, Silas said slowly, that people spend too much time worrying about other people's business. He went inside. Sarah stood in the snow for a moment longer, Ben's words echoing in her mind. Difficult. Unmarriageable. She'd heard it all before. But somehow, hearing it again still hurt. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the soft crackle of the fire. Across the room, Silas's breathing was slow and even. She thought about Grace, wondered where she was, if the rancher was treating her well, if she was warm, if she was safe. Grace, who'd always been the favored one, the beautiful one, the one people wanted, and Sarah, who'd been the one people tolerated, the strong one, the capable one, the one nobody chose. Except Silas had chosen her. She still didn't understand why. You're thinking too loud, Silas said from the darkness. Sarah startled. I thought you were asleep. Hard to sleep when someone's thinking that loud. She exhaled a shaky breath. I'm sorry. Don't be. A pause. What's on your mind? I don't understand why you did it. Why you paid for me. Silas was quiet for a long time. You ever see someone standing at the edge of something and know they're about to fall? Yes. That's what you looked like. In that saloon, like you were already falling and nobody cared enough to catch you. Sarah's throat closed. So you caught me. I tried. Why? Another long silence, then, "Because nobody caught me when I was falling. And I remember what that felt like." Sarah closed her eyes, tears slipping hot down her temples. "Get some sleep, Sarah," Silas said quietly. She didn't answer, couldn't, but eventually exhaustion pulled her under, and she slept. The next morning, Sarah woke with a new resolve. She would prove them wrong, all of them. The people in town, her father, the voice in her own head that whispered, she wasn't enough. She would show them what she was capable of. She started with the chickens. The coop was a disaster, rotting boards, broken hinges, nests fouled with old straw. Silas had been managing it, but barely. Sarah spent the better part of the morning tearing it apart and rebuilding it, her hands raw and cold but steady. When Silas came back from checking traps and saw what she'd done, he stopped in his tracks. "You fixed the coop?" It needed fixing. He walked around it, inspecting her work, the new board she'd scavenged from the barn, the way she'd reinforced the hinges with wire. "You do this yourself?" "Yes." He looked at her, something close to surprise in his eyes. "You know carpentry?" "I know how to make things work." Silas nodded slowly. "You do good work." It was a small thing, just 4 words. But Sarah felt something in her chest crack open, something warm and unfamiliar, pride. She smiled. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Silas said. "You earned it." And for the first time in her life, Sarah believed him. The weeks that followed brought a shift neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both felt settling into the spaces between words. Sarah rebuilt the chicken coop on Monday. By Tuesday, she'd patched 3 holes in the barn roof where snow had been leaking through. Wednesday found her oiling every hinge in the cabin until the doors stopped shrieking. Silas watched her work with an expression somewhere between bewilderment and something that might have been respect, though he never said as much directly. What he did say, on Thursday morning as she came inside from hauling firewood, was, "You're going to work yourself sick." Sarah set down the armload of split logs, brushing bark dust from her sleeves. "I'm fine. You've been outside since dawn. It's barely above freezing." "So have you." "I'm used to it." She straightened, meeting his eyes. "Then I'll get used to it too." Silas opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he poured coffee into her cup without asking and set it on the table. "At least warm up first." It was as close to concern as he ever came, and Sarah found herself almost smiling as she wrapped her hands around the tin cup. The heat seeped into her palms, and she closed her eyes briefly, letting the steam rise against her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. Silas grunted something that might have been acknowledgement and returned to the rifle he'd been cleaning at the table. They sat in silence, the kind that had become comfortable, familiar. Sarah sipped her coffee and watched him work, the methodical way his hands moved over metal and wood, checking each mechanism with practiced care. "You planning to hunt?" she asked. "Elk, if I can find one. We're low on meat. Can I come?" His hands stilled. He looked up at her, considering. "It's a long walk, cold. You'd need to stay quiet for hours." "I can do that. It's not easy." "I didn't ask if it was easy. I asked if I could come." Something flickered in his expression. Approval, maybe, or curiosity. "All right, tomorrow, before dawn. Dress warm." Sarah nodded and said nothing more, but inside something settled. He was letting her in, piece by piece, into the rhythms of this life. Not because he had to, because he was choosing to. The next morning arrived bitter and dark. Sarah woke to Silas moving through the cabin, already dressed, setting out supplies. She rose quickly, pulling on every layer she owned, and joined him at the table where he'd laid out strips of dried venison and a canteen. "Eat," he said. "We won't stop once we start." They ate standing quickly, then stepped out into air so cold it stung Sarah's lungs. The sky above was still black, scattered with stars that seemed too bright, too close. Silas shouldered his rifle and nodded toward the tree line. "Stay behind me. Step where I step. No talking unless I talk first." Sarah followed him into the forest. The world transformed under the cover of pine and shadow. Snow muffled every sound except the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of something wild. Silas moved like part of the landscape itself, steady, deliberate, reading signs Sarah couldn't see. A broken twig, tracks in the snow, the way the wind shifted. They walked for what felt like hours, climbing higher into terrain that grew rockier, steeper. Sarah's legs burned, her breath came hard, but she didn't complain, didn't slow. When Silas glanced back to check on her, she met his gaze steadily, and he nodded once before continuing. Finally, as pale light began to seep through the trees, Silas stopped. He pointed to a clearing ahead where the land opened into a small meadow bordered by aspens. Then he crouched low behind a fallen log and motioned for Sarah to do the same. They waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. Sarah's muscles cramped. Cold seeped through her coat. She focused on breathing quietly, on staying absolutely still, the way Silas did. He didn't fidget, didn't shift. He simply waited, rifle resting across his knees, eyes scanning the clearing with patient intensity. Then she saw it. Movement at the far edge of the meadow. A shape emerging from the shadows, massive, elegant. An elk, its antlers wide and branching, breath steaming in the cold air. It stepped into the clearing cautiously, testing the wind, then lowered its head to paw at the snow. Silas raised his rifle slowly, infinitely slowly. He sighted down the barrel, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the silence. The elk staggered, took 2 steps, and fell. Silas was already moving, rifle slung over his shoulder, knife in hand. Sarah followed, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the raw immediacy of what she'd just witnessed. Life and death measured in a single breath. By the time she reached him, Silas was kneeling beside the animal, his hand resting briefly on its neck in something that looked like respect. Then he began the work of field dressing, quick and efficient. Sarah watched, then knelt beside him. "Show me," she said. He looked at her, surprise crossing his face. "You sure?" "Yes." So he did. He showed her how to make the first cut, how to open the cavity without puncturing the organs, how to separate what could be used from what couldn't. It was brutal work, bloody and hard, and Sarah's hands shook at first. But she steadied them. She learned. When it was done, Silas sat back on his heels, wiping his knife on the snow. "You did good." "I didn't do much." "You didn't flinch. That's something." Sarah looked at her hands, stained dark despite the cold. "My mother used to say waste was a sin. If something dies, you honor it by using every part." "Your mother was right." They worked together to quarter the elk, wrapping the meat in canvas Silas had brought. It took the better part of 2 hours, and by the time they started back, the sun was fully up, turning the snow to blinding white. The walk home was slower, heavier. They took turns carrying the meat, and when Sarah stumbled under the weight, Silas took her load without comment and shouldered it alongside his own. "I can carry it," she protested. "I know you can, but you don't have to." It was such a simple thing, but it landed in Sarah's chest like something precious. They reached the cabin as the sun touched the tops of the western peaks. Silas hung the meat in the smokehouse, and Sarah pumped water to wash the blood from her hands and arms. The cold water bit, but she scrubbed until her skin was raw and clean. Inside, Silas built up the fire and put coffee on. They sat together in exhausted silence, and Sarah realized she felt more alive than she had in years. Tired, yes, sore, but present in her own body in a way she'd forgotten was possible. "Thank you for taking me," she said. Silas looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Thank you for keeping up." "Did you think I wouldn't?" "Wasn't sure." He took a drink. "Most people give up when things get hard. I'm not most people." "No," Silas said quietly. "You're not." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, unspoken but real. They were both people the world had tried to break, and somehow they'd both refused to stay broken. The days grew longer, though winter still held the mountains in its grip. Sarah fell into the work of the homestead as if she'd been born to it. She learned to read the weather by the way the wind moved through the pines, to predict snow by the silence that settled over the land. She learned which herbs Silas kept for medicine and which for cooking, how to render fat for soap, how to mend harness leather so it wouldn't crack. Silas, in turn, began to talk more. Not a lot. He'd never be a man of many words, but enough. He told her about the trap line, about the year a bear had torn through his supplies, and he'd survived on roots and whatever small game he could snare. He told her about building the cabin himself, log by log, after he'd decided the world below held nothing he wanted anymore. He didn't talk about the scar. Sarah didn't ask. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Sarah mending a torn shirt and Silas working a piece of leather into a new belt, she said, "Do you ever miss it? Town, I mean. People." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his hands still moving. "Sometimes. Then I remember why I left, and I don't miss it anymore." "What made you leave?" He set down the leather and looked into the fire. "I had a wife once, a son. Sick." Sarah's hand stilled on the needle. "Fire took them both," Silas continued, his voice flat, factual. "I was away, checking trap lines. Came back to find the cabin burned, them inside. After that, nothing down there made sense anymore, so I came up here." Sarah's chest tightened. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it easier." "No," Silas agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in silence, and Sarah understood something new about the man across from her. He hadn't brought her here out of pity or charity. He'd brought her here because he knew what it felt like to have the ground fall away beneath you, to stand in a room full of people and feel utterly alone. "My mother died when I was 14, Sarah said quietly. "After that, my father changed, started drinking, started blaming Grace and me for everything. We moved from town to town, always running from debts he wouldn't pay." She set down the shirt. "I spent so long trying to be what he needed. Strong enough, quiet enough, useful enough. It was never enough." "It was never about you," Silas said. "People like that, they're drowning, and they'll pull anyone down with them if you let them." "I know that now." "Good." Sarah looked at him, at the way firelight played across his scarred face, and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just survival anymore. It wasn't just refuge. It was something else, something she didn't have words for yet. "Silas?" He looked up. "Thank you for pulling me out before I drowned." His expression softened, just barely, just enough. "You pulled yourself out. I just opened the door." The first real signs of trouble came on a Tuesday. Ben rode up the mountain again, this time with urgency written across his weathered face. Silas met him outside, and Sarah joined them, wiping flour from her hands. "What's wrong?" Silas asked. Ben dismounted heavily. "There's talk, corporate men from back east surveying land in the valley. They're looking to expand rail lines, maybe mining operations. They've been asking questions about who owns what up here." Silas's jaw tightened. "This land is mine. I've got the deed." "I know that. But these men, they don't always care about deeds. They've got lawyers, money. They're saying some of the mountain claims are invalid, that the original surveys were done wrong." "That's a lie. Probably. But they've got enough backing to make it stick if they want to." Ben glanced at Sarah, then back at Silas. "There's something else. Jacob Brennan's been talking, saying the marriage contract wasn't legitimate, that his daughter was coerced." Sarah's blood went cold. "What?" "He's trying to get the debt reinstated, claiming Silas took advantage, that the whole thing was fraud." Silas's face darkened. "He signed the papers. Took the money." "I'm just telling you what's being said." Ben shifted his weight. "You need to be careful. These corporate men, they're looking for any excuse to claim land. And if they can say your homestead is tied up in legal questions, they'll use it. Let them try." "Silas?" Ben's voice was firm. "I mean it. This isn't just talk. They've already pushed out 2 families down in the valley, claimed their titles weren't valid, brought in marshals to enforce it. People lost everything." Silas was silent, his hands clenched at his sides. Sarah spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "What do we need to do?" Ben looked at her with something like approval. "Get your papers in order. Make sure the deed's recorded properly. And if they come asking questions, don't give them anything they can twist." He paused. "Might help to have witnesses. People who can testify that the marriage is legitimate, that you're building a life here." "We are building a life here," Sarah said firmly. Ben nodded. Then make sure people know it. After he left, Silas stood in the snow for a long time, staring south toward the valley. Sarah came to stand beside him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I should have known this would happen. Nothing stays simple." "We'll fight it." He looked at her. "This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is." Sarah met his eyes. "I'm here. This is my home now, too. And I'm not letting anyone take it." Something fierce flickered in Silas's expression. "All right then, we fight." They spent the next 2 days going through every paper Silas owned, the deed to the land, records of payment, surveys, and maps. Sarah helped him organize everything, making notes of dates and names. Anything that could prove his claim was legitimate. In the middle of this, a rider came. Not Ben this time, but a younger man in a fine coat, riding a horse too expensive for mountain travel. He stopped at the edge of the property and called out, "Mr. Kane? I'm looking for Mr. Silas Kane." Silas stepped out of the cabin, Sarah close behind him. "That's me." The man dismounted, brushing snow from his sleeves. "My name is Richard Hastings. I represent the Continental Development Corporation. We're conducting surveys in this region, and I'd like to ask you a few questions about your land claim." "My land's not for sale." "I'm not here to buy it, Mr. Kane, just to verify certain details for our records." Hastings pulled out a leather notebook. "How long have you held this property?" 8 years. "And you have a deed?" "Recorded and legal." "I see. And you're married, I understand." Silas's eyes narrowed. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Just confirming residency, making sure the claim is being actively maintained." Hastings glanced at Sarah. "This is your wife?" "Yes," Silas said flatly. Sarah stepped forward. "Sarah Kane, is there something specific you need, Mr. Hastings?" Hastings smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just doing my job, ma'am. There have been some questions about the legitimacy of certain land claims in this area. We're making sure everything is in order." "It is," Sarah said. "Of course. Though I understand there was some unusual circumstances surrounding your marriage. A rather public transaction in town, from what I hear." Sarah's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice level. "My husband paid my father's debts and offered me a home. There's nothing unusual about that." "No, of course not." Hastings made a note. "And you're happy here?" "Yes." "Even in winter? Isolated, cold, difficult conditions?" "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Hastings." He looked up from his notebook, studying her. "No, I suppose you're not." He turned back to Silas. "Well, I think that's all for now. We'll be in touch if we need anything further." "Don't bother," Silas said. Hastings smiled again, tipped his hat, and rode off. Sarah and Silas stood watching until he disappeared into the trees. Then Silas swore, low and vicious. "They're circling," he said. "I know. They're going to try to take this place." "Not if we don't let them." Silas looked at her, and Sarah saw the fear beneath his anger. Not fear for himself, but fear of losing the only piece of ground he'd managed to claim after everything had been taken from him. "We need help," she said quietly. "We can't do this alone." "I don't have people, Sarah." "Then we'll find them." That evening, Sarah sat down and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Grace, sent care of the rancher who'd claimed her. Sarah didn't know if her sister would respond, but she tried anyway, explaining what was happening and asking if Grace knew anything about their father's new scheming. The second letter was harder. She addressed it to the land office, formally requesting copies of all records related to Silas's claim. She wrote carefully, precisely, using every bit of education her mother had given her before she died. When she finished, she showed both letters to Silas. He read them slowly, then looked at her with something like wonder. "You write well." "My mother taught me. She said words were the only power women were allowed to have, so we'd better learn to use them." She was right. He folded the letters carefully. "I'll take these down to Ben tomorrow. He can get them sent." "I'll come with you." "Sarah, I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "If they're going to question whether I'm really your wife, whether I really live here, then people need to see me. See us, together." Silas studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." The ride down to Ben's place took most of the morning. Sarah sat beside Silas on the wagon seat, wrapped in furs against the cold, and watched the landscape change as they descended. The air grew warmer, the snow shallower. Signs of other homesteads appeared, fences, smoke from distant chimneys. Ben's ranch sat in a sheltered valley, a cluster of buildings surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. When they arrived, Ben came out to meet them, his eyes widening slightly when he saw Sarah. "Mrs. Kane," he said with genuine warmth. "Good to see you." Sarah climbed down from the wagon. "Mr. Patterson?" "Just Ben, please." He looked at Silas. "What brings you down?" Silas handed him the letters. "Need these sent, soon as possible." Ben read them, his expression growing serious. "You're taking this to the land office?" "We're doing it right," Sarah said. "By the book, no room for questions." "Smart." Ben folded the letters. "I'll get these out today. Anything else?" "Yeah," Silas said. "I need to know who else is being squeezed. If Continental's pushing people out, we need to know who and how." Ben scratched his beard. "I can ask around, but Silas, you're talking about organizing, fighting back. These people have money and lawyers. We have the truth. Truth doesn't always win." "Then we'll make it win," Sarah said quietly. Both men looked at her. She met their gazes steadily, and Ben smiled, a real smile this time. "You picked a strong one, Silas." "She picked herself," Silas corrected. They stayed for a meal. Ben's wife, Martha, insisted. She was a round, kind-faced woman who welcomed Sarah like family, asking about the cabin, about supplies, about whether Sarah needed anything for the kitchen. It was the first real kindness from another woman Sarah had experienced in longer than she could remember, and she found herself close to tears more than once. Over stew and cornbread, Ben shared what he knew. Continental Development had surveyed land all through the valley, claiming mineral rights and railroad easements. They'd pushed out the Morrison family last month, using some technicality about water rights. The Clarks were fighting them in court, but it was expensive, draining them dry. "They're targeting people who are isolated," Ben said. "People who don't have family, don't have connections. They figure those folks won't fight." "They figured wrong," Silas said. Ben raised his cup. "To being wrong, then." On the ride back, as evening shadows stretched across the snow, Sarah said, "Martha's nice. Ben's lucky. She asked if I needed anything, offered to lend me fabric, seeds for spring planting. You going to take her up on it?" "Maybe." Sarah paused. "She said I was welcome to visit any time, that it would be good for both of us to have another woman to talk to." Silas glanced at her. "You should go, when you want to." "You wouldn't mind?" "Why would I mind?" "I don't know, I just—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Sarah, this isn't a prison. You're free to come and go as you please. Visit who you want. I'm not going to stop you." "I know, I just wasn't sure if—" "If what?" She took a breath. "If you'd want me to. Build connections, I mean. Make friends. Stay." Silas was quiet for a long moment, the wagon creaking beneath them. Then he said, "I want you to do whatever makes you happy. If that means staying, stay. If it means leaving, leave. But don't stay because you think you owe me something. Stay because you want to." "And if I want to?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something warm and careful and real. "Then I want you to stay," he said quietly. Sarah's breath caught. "Silas, we're here." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. The sun was setting, painting the snow gold and pink. Smoke rose from the chimney. Silas had banked the fire before they left, and it had kept. They climbed down together, and Silas began unhitching the horse. Sarah stood for a moment, looking at the cabin, the barn, the land stretching away into darkening forest. This place, this hard, cold, beautiful place. She'd come here as payment for a debt, a transaction, a burden nobody wanted. But somewhere along the way, between the work and the silence and the small kindnesses neither of them knew how to name, it had become something else. It had become home. And she wasn't going to let anyone take it from them. The letter from Grace arrived 3 weeks later, carried up the mountain by Ben during one of his supply runs. Sarah took it with trembling hands, the paper worn from travel, Her sister's familiar handwriting scrawled across the envelope. She waited until evening to open it, sitting by the fire while Silas worked on repairing a saddle across the table. The wax seal broke easily, and Sarah unfolded the single page, her eyes scanning the words. Grace's news was both better and worse than Sarah had feared. The rancher, Thomas Whitmore, was treating her well, kindly even. He was older, patient, and seemed genuinely grateful for her company. But Grace wrote of loneliness, of long days in a house too quiet, of conversations that never went deeper than the weather or what to cook for supper. She wrote of missing Sarah with an ache that made the words shake on the page. And then, near the end, Grace wrote something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Father came to visit last week. He brought men with him. Lawyers, he said. They asked Thomas questions about you, about Silas, about the marriage. Father told them you'd been forced, that Silas had taken advantage. Thomas didn't believe him, told them to leave. But Sarah, they're building a case. Father's working with those corporate men. He told me himself, bragging about how he'd get his money back and more besides. He's going to try to have the marriage annulled and claim Silas's land as compensation. Please be careful. I don't know what he'll do, but I know he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Sarah read the passage 3 times, her hands shaking harder with each reading. Finally, she set the letter down and looked at Silas. My father's working with Continental Development, she said quietly. He's telling them I was forced into this marriage. He wants it annulled so he can claim this land as damages. Silas's hand stilled on the leather. His jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Can he do that? I don't know, but he's going to try. Sarah stood, pacing to the window. Outside, snow was falling again, thick and silent. Grace says he brought lawyers to question her husband. He's building a case. A case built on lies. Lies backed by men with money. Sarah turned to face him. Silas, if they annul the marriage, they could claim you acted fraudulently. Take the land, maybe worse. Let them try. This isn't something we can just fight off with stubbornness. Silas set down the saddle and stood, crossing to where she stood. Then what do you suggest? Sarah thought for a moment, her mind racing through possibilities. We prove it's real. The marriage, this life. We get witnesses, documentation, anything that shows this isn't fraud. How? We go to town. Together. We let people see us, talk to us. We act like what we are, a married couple building a homestead. She met his eyes. And we make sure everyone knows I chose this, that I'm here because I want to be. Silas studied her face, and Sarah saw the question he didn't ask aloud. Do you want to be here? Or are you just saying that because you have to? I mean it, she said softly. This is my home now. I'm not letting anyone take it from us. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, gratitude, something deeper. All right, we'll go to town. Make ourselves visible. There's more. Sarah hesitated. If we're going to convince anyone this marriage is legitimate, we need to make it legitimate. Legally, I mean. We signed papers, but we never... She stopped, heat rising in her cheeks. Silas understood. We never made it binding. No. A long silence stretched between them. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Is that what you want? Silas asked finally. Sarah thought about it honestly. She thought about the man standing before her, scarred and solitary and kinder than he knew. She thought about the months they'd spent building something together, trust and respect earned through shared work and quiet evenings. She thought about how safe she felt here, how seen. Yes, she said. If you'll have me, really have me. Not as payment or obligation, but as a choice. Silas crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. He took her hands, rough, calloused hands that had rebuilt chicken coops and field-dressed elk and never once struck her in anger. Sarah Brennan, he said quietly, I chose you the day I walked into that saloon. Not because I pitied you, because I saw someone strong enough to survive what would have broken most people, someone who deserved better than what she'd been given. He paused. If you'll have me, a man who lives in the mountains and doesn't talk much and comes with more ghosts than future, then yes, I want this to be real." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I'll have you." Silas pulled her into his arms, and Sarah let herself be held, her face pressed against his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. They stood like that for a long time, while the fire burned low and the snow fell, and something new and fragile began to take root between them. That night, for the first time, Sarah didn't sleep in the narrow bed alone. Silas held her beneath the quilts, their bodies fitting together with surprising ease, and when morning came, they woke tangled in each other and didn't speak of it. They didn't need to. The trip to town was planned for the following week. In the days before, Sarah and Silas went through everything again: papers, dates, evidence of their life together. Sarah wrote out a statement describing the events of that night in the saloon, how Silas had offered her a choice, how she'd taken it freely. She wrote about the work they'd done together, the home they were building. She dated it and signed it, and Silas did the same on a separate page. Martha Patterson rode up 2 days before they were set to leave, bringing fabric and news. Continental had made formal claims against 3 more properties, including one that bordered Silas's land to the east. The family there, the Hendersons, had already packed and left, too frightened to fight. "They're closing in," Martha said, sitting at the table with Sarah while Silas and Ben talked outside. "Ben's organizing the ones who'll stay. There's going to be a meeting in town, at the church hall. People need to stand together on this." "When?" Sarah asked. "Saturday, 2 days after you get there." Martha reached across and squeezed Sarah's hand. "It'll be good for people to see you, to know Silas isn't alone in this." "He's not alone," Sarah said firmly. Martha smiled. "I can see that. And I think everyone else will too." They left on Thursday morning, the wagon loaded with furs to trade and supplies they'd need for the trip. Sarah wore her best dress, not much by town standards, but clean and mended, and the coat Silas had given her that first night. Silas drove in silence, his face set, and Sarah knew he was preparing himself for whatever waited below. The town had grown since Sarah had last seen it. New buildings lined the main street, and the saloon where her father had sold her now had competition from a hotel that looked almost respectable. People moved through the streets with purpose, and Sarah saw surveying equipment outside what appeared to be a new land office. Silas pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and climbed down. He came around to help Sarah, and she took his hand, letting him steady her as she stepped to the ground. People were watching. She could feel their stares, their whispers. "Ready?" Silas asked quietly. Sarah lifted her chin. "Ready." They walked into the store together, Silas's hand resting lightly on Sarah's back. The proprietor, a thin man named Hutchins, looked up from his ledger and his eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Kane, Mrs. Kane." He nodded to each of them. "What can I do for you?" Silas handed him a list. "Need these supplies, and we've got furs to trade." While Hutchins reviewed the list, Sarah walked through the store, examining fabric and notions with the careful attention of someone who knew the value of every penny. She was aware of other customers watching, women in particular, their expressions ranging from curiosity to something that might have been disapproval. One of them, a heavy-set woman in an expensive dress, approached Sarah near the ribbon display. "You're Jacob Brennan's daughter," she said. Not a question. "I was," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm Sarah Kane now. I heard about what happened. In the saloon." "Did you?" "People talk." The woman lowered her voice. "They say you were sold like livestock, that Kane took advantage." Sarah set down the ribbon she'd been examining and turned to face the woman fully. "People say a lot of things. Most of them aren't true. So you're saying you chose this, to live up in the mountains with a—" She stopped, seeming to think better of whatever she'd been about to say. "With my husband," Sarah finished. "Yes, I chose it. I choose it every day." "Even in winter? Even isolated like that?" "Isolation's better than cruelty," Sarah said quietly. "I learned that a long time ago." The woman blinked, taken aback, and Sarah moved past her to where Silas was settling accounts with Hutchins. She stood beside him, close enough that anyone watching would understand they were together, and when Silas glanced at her, she gave him a small nod. They finished their business and loaded the supplies into the wagon. As they worked, a man approached, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sarah recognized him immediately from Ben's description. Richard Hastings. "Mr. Kane," Hastings said pleasantly. "What a coincidence. I was hoping to run into you." "Were you?" Silas's voice was flat. "I wanted to inform you personally that Continental Development will be filing formal claims on several properties in the mountain region, including the parcel adjacent to yours. We're hoping to avoid legal complications, so I thought I'd give you advance notice." "Notice of what?" "That we'll be contesting certain deeds in the area. Some of the original surveys were incomplete, you see. Boundaries unclear. We're simply trying to establish proper ownership." "The boundaries of my land are perfectly clear," Silas said. "Are they?" Hastings pulled out a folded map. "Because according to our surveys, there's some question about where your eastern boundary actually lies. If it's where we believe it is, you're occupying land that was never properly claimed." Sarah stepped forward. "May I see that?" Hastings looked surprised, but handed her the map. Sarah studied it carefully, comparing it to the mental image she'd built from the deed they'd reviewed. After a moment, she pointed to a section. "This is wrong," she said. "The eastern boundary follows Copper Creek, not Willow Creek. Your map has them reversed." "I assure you, our surveyors are quite thorough." "Then they made a thorough mistake." Sarah handed the map back. "Copper Creek is nearly a mile east of where you've marked it, which means our land is exactly where the deed says it is." Hastings' pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Well, that will be for the courts to decide, won't it, Mrs. Kane?" "If necessary," Sarah said, "though I expect the courts will find our deed perfectly valid." "We'll see." Hastings tipped his hat. "Good day to you both." He walked away, and Silas looked at Sarah with something close to amazement. "How did you know about the creeks?" "I've been studying the land, walking it, learning every ridge and stream." She smiled slightly. "My mother used to say knowledge is the only thing nobody can take from you. Figured I should gather as much as I could." Silas shook his head slowly. "You're something else, Sarah Kane." They spent the night at Ben and Martha's ranch, where Martha insisted on feeding them properly, and Ben shared what he'd learned about Continental's tactics. The company was using a combination of legal pressure and intimidation, finding any small irregularity in deeds, then offering to settle for a fraction of the land's worth. Those who refused found themselves tied up in expensive legal battles they couldn't afford to fight. "The meeting on Saturday is crucial," Ben said over supper. "We need to show them we're organized, that we won't be pushed around one by one." "How many are coming?" Silas asked. "Hard to say. Some folks are too scared. Others have already lost their land and moved on." Ben looked at Sarah. "But having you there will help. People need to see that this isn't just about property. It's about homes, families, lives." Saturday arrived cold and clear. The church hall filled slowly with homesteaders and small ranchers, men and women with work-worn hands and worried faces. Sarah sat beside Silas in the back, watching people filter in, counting them. Maybe 40 in all. Not enough, but more than she'd feared. Ben called the meeting to order, standing at the front of the hall with a map tacked to the wall behind him. "We're all here for the same reason," he began. "Continental Development is trying to take our land. They're using legal tricks, false surveys, intimidation. They're counting on us being too isolated, too poor, or too scared to fight back." "What can we do?" someone called out. "They've got lawyers. We've got nothing." "We've got the truth," Ben said. "And we've got each other. If we stand together, pool our resources, we can hire a lawyer of our own. We can challenge their surveys. We can make this costly enough that they'll move on to easier targets." "And if we can't?" another voice asked. "Then we lose everything," Ben said bluntly. "But I'd rather lose fighting than lose standing still." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah could feel the fear, the uncertainty. These were people who'd already lost so much, who'd come to this hard country hoping for a fresh start. The thought of losing again was almost too much to bear. She stood, heads turned. Silas looked up at her, surprise crossing his face. "My name is Sarah Kane," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "Some of you know me. Some of you know what happened in the saloon a few months back when my father sold me to settle his debts." The room went completely silent. You want to know if I was forced into marrying Silas? If I'm here against my will? Sarah looked around the room, meeting eyes. I'm not. I chose to leave with him because he offered me something nobody else ever had, a choice, dignity, respect. He gave me a home, and together we've built a life. It's hard. It's cold. But it's ours. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Continental Development wants to take that from us. They want to take it from all of us. And they're using my father's lies to do it, claiming Silas acted fraudulently, that I'm not really his wife. Well, I am, and I'm standing here to tell anyone who'll listen that I won't let them destroy what we've built, not without a fight. Sarah sat down, her heart pounding. Silas reached over and took her hand, squeezing it once. An older woman in the front row stood. My husband and I have been on our land for 12 years. We've broken ground, raised cattle, survived winters that killed half our herd. I'll be damned if I let some corporation take it because they've got fancier lawyers than us. She looked around. I'm in. Whatever it takes. Another man stood, then another. Within minutes, nearly everyone in the room was on their feet, voices overlapping with pledges to fight, to pool money, to stand together. Ben raised his hands for quiet. All right, here's what we do. We hire Samuel Thornton. He's a land attorney out of Denver, honest, knows territorial law. We gather every deed, every survey, every piece of paper that proves our claims, and we prepare to take this to court if we have to. What about the costs? Someone asked. We share them. Everyone contributes what they can. The Pattersons will hold the funds, keep records. Anyone who can't afford to pay can contribute labor, supplies, whatever they've got. And if we lose, Ben's face was grim, then at least we went down fighting. The meeting continued for another hour, organizing committees, assigning tasks. Sarah volunteered to help Martha keep records, to write letters to territorial offices requesting official surveys. Silas pledged money and offered the use of his wagon for hauling supplies. As people filed out, several approached Sarah and Silas directly. Some shook their hands. Others just nodded with new respect. The heavy-set woman from the general store, Sarah had learned her name was Mrs. Gentry, stopped in front of them. I owe you an apology, she said to Sarah. I believed what people were saying about you, about your marriage. I was wrong. Thank you, Sarah said quietly. Mrs. Gentry looked at Silas. You've got a strong wife, Mr. Kane. Lucky man. I know, Silas said. After the hall emptied, Sarah and Silas walked back to Ben and Martha's wagon in silence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah felt exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if speaking her truth aloud had lifted a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. You didn't have to do that, Silas said as they climbed onto the wagon seat. Yes, I did. You put yourself out there, made yourself vulnerable. So did you, Sarah said, the day you walked into that saloon. Silas was quiet for a moment. I meant what I said earlier, about being lucky. I'm the lucky one. Sarah? I mean it. She looked at him, this man who'd given her more than he'd ever know. Before you, I didn't know what it felt like to be chosen, to be valued. You gave me that. Silas reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You gave yourself that. I just opened the door. They rode back to the Pattersons' ranch as darkness fell, and that night, lying in the guest room Martha had prepared, Sarah and Silas held each other and talked until late, about everything and nothing, their fears for the coming fight, their hopes for the land, small memories from childhoods that felt like they'd belonged to different people entirely. And when Sarah finally fell asleep, it was with Silas's arms around her and the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The summons came 2 weeks later. A marshal rode up to the cabin on a gray morning, carrying official papers that required Silas's signature. Continental Development Corporation versus Silas Kane, contesting ownership of the mountain property. The hearing was set for 3 weeks hence in the territorial courthouse. Silas read the papers twice, his face unreadable. Then he handed them to Sarah. She scanned the legal language, picking out the key accusations. Fraudulent claim, invalid survey, marriage of questionable legitimacy. It was all there, wrapped in official terminology designed to make it sound reasonable, legal, true. "They're serious," she said. "Yeah. We need Thornton, now." Silas nodded and rode down to Ben's that afternoon. By evening, they'd sent word to Denver, requesting the lawyer's immediate assistance. By the end of the week, Thornton had arrived, a lean man in his 50s with sharp eyes and sharper questions. He spent 3 days going through everything: the deed, the surveys, the marriage contract, Sarah's written statement, letters from Ben and Martha testifying to the legitimacy of the marriage and the homestead. He asked Sarah questions that made her blush, questions about her relationship with Silas, about their daily life, about whether she'd been coerced. She answered everything honestly, and Thornton seemed satisfied. "Your case is solid," he said finally, sitting at the cabin table with papers spread before him. "The deed is valid, properly recorded, the survey is accurate, and the marriage, while unusual in its origins, appears to be genuine in practice." "It is genuine," Sarah said firmly. Thornton looked at her. "I believe you, but Continental will argue otherwise. They'll paint you as a victim, Silas as a predator. They'll try to prove you had no choice, that you're still trapped here. Then I'll prove them wrong. You'll have to, in court, under oath, with your father likely in the room." Sarah's stomach clenched, but she didn't flinch. "I can do that." "You'll need to." Thornton gathered his papers. "Because this isn't just about property anymore. They're making it personal. If they can discredit the marriage, they can claim the entire homestead was established under false pretenses. Everything you've built will be forfeit." Silas stood abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders tight. "There's something else," Thornton continued. "I've been looking into Continental's ownership structure. They're backed by Eastern money, railroad interests. This isn't just about your land, Mr. Kane. It's about controlling access to the entire mountain range. They want rail lines through here, mining operations. Your property sits at a crucial junction. If they get it, they can claim the whole corridor." "So this was never about invalid deeds," Sarah said. "No, that's just the excuse. They want the land, and they'll use whatever means necessary to get it." Silas turned from the window. "Then we'll use whatever means necessary to keep it." Thornton smiled grimly. "Good, because they won't fight fair, and neither can we." The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. Thornton drilled Sarah on testimony, teaching her how to answer questions directly, how to stay calm under pressure, how to present herself as credible and self-possessed. He coached Silas, too, though Silas's natural reticence made it harder. Martha came up twice to help Sarah prepare, bringing a dress she'd altered to fit, something respectable enough for court. Ben organized the other homesteaders, ensuring they'd have witnesses if needed. And through it all, Sarah and Silas worked the land together, maintaining the routines that had become their life. Because regardless of what happened in court, this was still their home, still worth fighting for. The night before they were set to leave for the courthouse, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay beside Silas, listening to his breathing, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong. "You're thinking too loud again," Silas murmured. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted. "Me too." She turned to face him in the darkness. "What if we lose? Then we start over somewhere else. I don't want somewhere else. I want here." "I know." He pulled her closer. "But if we lose the land, we don't lose each other. That's what matters." Sarah buried her face against his chest. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I just know what's worth keeping." They held each other until dawn broke gray and cold through the window, and then they rose and prepared for the fight of their lives. The courthouse stood at the center of town like a monument to permanence, its stone facade gray and unyielding against the morning sky. Sarah climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady after the long ride, and stared up at the building that would decide their fate. People were already gathering on the steps, homesteaders she recognized from the meeting, townspeople drawn by curiosity, and men in expensive suits who could only be Continental's lawyers. Silas came around the wagon and offered his arm. Sarah took it, drawing strength from the solid warmth of him beside her. They dressed carefully that morning. Silas in his one good suit, brushed clean and mended at the elbows, Sarah in Martha's altered dress, her hair pinned back in a way that made her look older, more severe. "Ready?" Silas asked quietly. Sarah nodded, though her throat was too tight for words. They climbed the steps together. Ben and Martha were waiting at the top, along with Thornton, who looked crisp and alert despite the early hour. He nodded to them both. "Remember what we practiced," he said to Sarah. "Answer only what's asked. Don't volunteer information. Stay calm, no matter what they say." "I will." "And Mr. Kane, let me do the talking unless I specifically ask you to speak. Understood?" Silas's jaw tightened, but he nodded. They entered the courthouse and were directed to a courtroom on the second floor. The space was smaller than Sarah had expected, with wooden benches arranged in rows and a raised platform at the front where the judge would sit. Continental's legal team was already there, 3 men in dark suits conferring over papers spread across their table. Richard Hastings sat behind them, looking confident and relaxed. And in the back corner, almost hidden in shadow, sat Jacob Brennan. Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't seen her father since that night in the saloon, and the sight of him now, older, thinner, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there before, hit her like a physical blow. He looked up as she entered, and their eyes met across the room. He looked away first. Sarah forced herself to keep moving, to take her seat beside Silas at the defendant's table. Her hands were shaking. She clasped them in her lap and focused on breathing, on staying present. The room filled slowly. Homesteaders took seats on one side, townspeople on the other. Mrs. Gentry came in and caught Sarah's eye, giving her a small nod of encouragement. Grace's husband, Thomas Whitmore, entered and sat near the back. Sarah was surprised to see him, but grateful. His presence meant something. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood as the judge entered, an older man with silver hair and a face that gave nothing away. He took his seat, arranged papers before him, and looked out over the assembled crowd. "Continental Development Corporation versus Silas Kane," he announced, "regarding contested land ownership in the Mountain Territory. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" "We are, Your Honor." The lead attorney for Continental stood, a tall man named Dalton who moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to winning. "Ready, Your Honor," Thornton said. The judge nodded. "Mr. Dalton, you may present your case." Dalton rose and approached the bench, carrying a leather portfolio. "Your Honor, this case concerns a matter of fraudulent land acquisition and an illegal marriage contract used to circumvent proper procedures. Continental Development has evidence that Mr. Silas Kane's claim to the disputed property is invalid on multiple grounds." He laid out Continental's argument methodically. The original survey was flawed, he claimed, producing maps and technical documents to support the assertion. The boundaries were unclear, possibly overlapping with unclaimed federal land. And most damning, he argued, the marriage that had supposedly established Kane's homestead was a sham, a transaction made under duress, with a woman who had no real choice in the matter. "We have testimony," Dalton said, "from Jacob Brennan, the young woman's father, who will attest that his daughter was coerced into this arrangement, that she was in effect sold to Mr. Kane in a public auction. Such a marriage cannot be considered legitimate under territorial law." Sarah felt Silas stiffen beside her, but he didn't move, didn't speak. Dalton continued for another 20 minutes, building his case piece by piece, painting Silas as an opportunist who'd taken advantage of a desperate situation, and Sarah as a victim too frightened to speak the truth. By the time he finished, murmurs were rippling through the courtroom. The judge looked at Thornton. "Your response, counselor?" Thornton stood, and Sarah was struck by how calm he appeared, almost relaxed. "Your Honor, Continental's case rests on 2 fundamental falsehoods. First, that the land survey is invalid. Second, that Mrs. Kane's marriage is illegitimate. We will demonstrate that both claims are categorically untrue." He walked to the front of the room carrying his own maps and documents. The survey in question was conducted in accordance with all territorial regulations. It was properly recorded and has been on file for 8 years without challenge. Continental's so-called corrected survey was only produced after they decided they wanted this particular piece of land, conveniently finding errors that would benefit their claim. Thornton spread the competing maps side by side. "Note here, Your Honor, that Continental's survey places Copper Creek nearly a mile east of its actual location. This is not a minor discrepancy. This is a deliberate falsification designed to create the appearance of disputed boundaries where none exist." "Objection," Dalton said. Counsel is impugning the integrity of licensed surveyors. Sustained. Mr. Thornton, confine yourself to the evidence. Of course, Your Honor. Thornton didn't look concerned. The evidence shows that Mr. Kane's boundaries follow natural landmarks. Copper Creek to the east, Devil's Ridge to the west, the Old Pine marking the northern point. These landmarks are documented, verifiable, and have been recognized by every survey since the original claim was filed. He returned to the table and picked up another document. As for the marriage, Your Honor, we have extensive testimony demonstrating that Mrs. Kane entered into this arrangement freely and has remained of her own volition. She is not a victim. She is a partner in a legitimate homestead. We'll hear from witnesses then, the judge said. Mr. Dalton, call your first witness. Dalton stood. Your Honor, we call Jacob Brennan. Sarah's father rose and walked to the witness stand. He looked smaller than Sarah remembered, diminished somehow. He took the oath and sat down, his hands folded in his lap. Dalton approached. Mr. Brennan, please tell the court about the events of the evening in question. Jacob cleared his throat. I was in debt, bad debt, to men who weren't going to wait any longer. They gave me an option, sign over guardianship of my daughters to settle accounts. Marriage contracts, they called them. And did you agree to this? I did. I had no choice. What happened next? They brought my girls downstairs. Grace, my younger daughter, she was bid on first. Several men were interested. She went to a rancher. Good man. Jacob's voice wavered. Then they put Sarah up. Nobody wanted her. Sarah felt the old shame rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. No bids at all? Dalton asked. None. They kept lowering the price, but nobody was interested. Then Silas Kane came in. He offered $50, said he'd cover my whole debt. Just like that. What was your impression of Mr. Kane's motives? Objection, Thornton said. Calls for speculation. Sustained, Dalton rephrased. Did Mr. Kane give any explanation for his offer? No, he just paid and took her. Didn't ask her what she wanted, didn't give her time to think, just wrapped her in his coat and walked out. So your daughter had no opportunity to refuse? No, sir, she didn't. Dalton nodded. And have you had contact with your daughter since that night? Once. She wrote to her sister. The letter said she was fine, but Jacob hesitated. I don't believe it. I think she's too scared to tell the truth. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. Thornton put a hand on her arm, a gentle warning to stay quiet. Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Dalton returned to his seat. The judge looked at Thornton. Cross-examination? Thornton rose slowly, studying Jacob with an expression that might have been pity. Mr. Brennan, you testified that you had no choice but to sign over guardianship of your daughters. Is that correct? Yes. But you did have choices, didn't you? You could have worked to pay off your debts. You could have sold property or possessions. You could have asked for more time. I tried all that. It didn't work. So when you say you had no choice, what you really mean is you chose the easiest option for yourself. The option that required your daughters to pay the price for your mistakes. Objection. Dalton was on his feet. Argumentative. Sustained. Mr. Thornton, ask questions. Don't make speeches. Apologies, Your Honor. Thornton didn't look apologetic. Mr. Brennan, how much did Continental Development pay you to testify here today? Jacob's face went pale. That's not... It's a simple question. Did Continental offer you money in exchange for your testimony? They offered to forgive some debts if I told the truth about what happened. To forgive debts you incurred after selling your daughters? New debts? Jacob said nothing. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a statement from the Silver Star Saloon showing that Mr. Brennan has accumulated over $300 in debts since the night in question. I also have a letter from Continental Development offering to settle these debts in exchange for his cooperation in this case. Thornton handed the documents to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Mr. Brennan, Thornton continued, you testified that you don't believe your daughter is truly happy in her marriage. When was the last time you actually spoke with her? At the saloon. So you haven't spoken to her in over 4 months, yet you're here claiming to know her state of mind. A father knows. Does he? Thornton's voice hardened. You knew she was unhappy growing up, that people mocked her, that she carried burdens no young woman should carry. Yet you did nothing. You knew she deserved better than to be auctioned off like property. Yet you signed the papers anyway. So forgive me, Mr. Brennan, if I question your sudden concern for your daughter's welfare. I made mistakes, Jacob said, his voice breaking. But I'm trying to make it right. By taking away the home she's built, the life she's chosen, that's your idea of making it right? Jacob had no answer. Thornton returned to his seat. No further questions. The judge dismissed Jacob, who walked back to his seat looking 10 years older. Sarah felt something twist in her chest. Not pity exactly, but a kind of sad recognition. Her father had always been weak. She'd known that. But seeing it displayed so publicly, so completely, still hurt. Dalton called Richard Hastings next, who testified about Continental surveys and their concerns about irregular land claims. Thornton cross-examined him ruthlessly, catching him in contradictions about when the surveys had been conducted and why Continental had only raised concerns after the railroad plans were announced. By the time Hastings stepped down, his confident demeanor had cracked considerably. Then came witnesses for the defense. Ben Patterson testified about the years he'd known Silas, about the homestead's legitimacy, about seeing Sarah and Silas together and believing their marriage was genuine. Martha spoke about her conversations with Sarah, about the woman's obvious care for her home and husband. Thomas Whitmore testified that Sarah had written to Grace voluntarily, that the letters showed no signs of coercion or fear. And then Thornton called Sarah herself. She rose on shaking legs and walked to the witness stand. The bailiff administered the oath, and Sarah promised to tell the truth, her voice steadier than she felt. She sat down and looked out at the courtroom, at the faces watching her, judging her, waiting to see if she would break. Thornton approached with a gentle expression. Mrs. Kane, please tell the court about the night you met your husband. Sarah took a breath. My father brought my sister and me to the saloon. He told us he'd signed papers, that we were being offered for marriage to settle his debts. Grace was bid on first. Several men wanted her. Then it was my turn. And what happened? Nobody bid. They kept lowering the price, but nobody wanted me. Sarah's voice didn't waver. I'd heard it all before, that I was too plain, too difficult, too much work for any man to want. So I wasn't surprised. But someone did make an offer. Yes, Silas Kane came in and offered $50, more than twice what anyone had started at. He said he'd cover my father's entire debt. What did you think when he made that offer? I thought he was either crazy or desperate. A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the courtroom. Did he force you to leave with him? Thornton asked. No, he asked me to choose. He said I could stay with my father or come with him, that it was my decision. And you chose to go with him? Yes. Why? Sarah looked at Silas, who sat at the defense table watching her with steady eyes. Because he was the first person in my life who'd ever asked what I wanted. The first person who treated me like I had value, like my choice mattered. I didn't know him, didn't know if I could trust him, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was, so I took the chance. And when you arrived at his homestead, what happened? He gave me his bed and slept on the floor. He told me I was free to leave whenever I wanted, that he wasn't holding me to anything. He gave me space to decide what I wanted my life to be. Did you feel trapped? No, I felt free for the first time in years. Thornton nodded. Tell the court about your life there, your daily routine. Sarah described it all, the work, the silences, the slow building of trust between two wounded people. She talked about learning to hunt, to mend, to read the weather, about long evenings by the fire and the gradual realization that she'd found something she never thought she'd have, a home. Mrs. Kane, Thornton said quietly, did you fall in love with your husband? Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. Yes, not at first, not even for a long time, but yes, I did. And does he love you? You'd have to ask him, but I believe he does. Thornton smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Kane. Your witness, Mr. Dalton. Dalton approached, his expression sympathetic in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. Mrs. Kane, I understand this is difficult, but I need to ask some hard questions. Go ahead. You testified that you felt free at Mr. Kane's homestead, but you were miles from town, in the middle of winter, with no money and nowhere else to go. How is that freedom? Freedom isn't about having unlimited options, Sarah said. It's about being able to make choices without fear. I could have left. Silas would have helped me. But I chose to stay. Because you had nowhere else to go. No, because I wanted to be there. Mrs. Kane, your father testified that you were sold in what amounted to a public auction. Doesn't that trouble you? Of course it troubles me. My father's choices trouble me. But that's not Silas's fault. He didn't create that situation. He just offered me a way out of it. A way out that benefited him significantly. He acquired a wife, unpaid labor for his homestead. I'm not unpaid labor, Sarah interrupted. I'm a partner. And anything I've done because I chose to, because it's my home too. Dalton's eyes narrowed. Your home. Yet it's in your husband's name only, isn't it? If this marriage were dissolved, you'd leave with nothing. If this marriage were dissolved, I'd leave with exactly what I came with, myself, which is more than I had before. That's a remarkably enlightened perspective for someone who was publicly humiliated and sold like livestock. Sarah felt anger flare, hot and bright. You want me to be a victim, Mr. Dalton. You want me to say I was forced, coerced, trapped, because that makes your case easier. But I'm not going to lie to help Continental steal land that doesn't belong to them. Your Honor, Dalton started. Mrs. Kane. The judge's voice was firm but not unkind. Please confine yourself to answering the questions. I apologize, Your Honor. Sarah took a breath. But I'm telling the truth. I chose this life. I choose it every day. And no amount of legal maneuvering is going to change that. Dalton tried several more approaches, asking about the isolation, the hardship, whether Sarah had been allowed to write to her sister freely. Sarah answered each question calmly, consistently, never wavering from her central truth. She was exactly where she wanted to be. Finally, Dalton gave up. No further questions. Thornton stood. Your Honor, we have one final witness. We call Silas Kane. Sarah returned to her seat as Silas rose and walked to the stand. He looked uncomfortable in his suit, uncomfortable with all the eyes on him, but he took the oath and sat down. Thornton's questions were brief. He established that Silas had paid for Sarah freely, that he'd never forced her to do anything, that their marriage had developed naturally over months of shared work and trust. Mr. Kane, Thornton said, why did you make that offer in the saloon? Silas was quiet for a moment. I saw someone who deserved better than what she was getting, and I had the means to help, that's all. Did you expect anything in return? No. But you got a wife. I got a partner, Silas corrected. Someone who chose to stay when she could have left. That's worth more than any contract. Thank you, Mr. Kane. Dalton's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to paint Silas as opportunistic, as someone who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. But Silas answered every question with the same blunt honesty, never embellishing, never defending himself beyond stating simple facts. His very plainness made him credible in a way no amount of rhetoric could match. When both sides had finished, the judge called for closing arguments. Dalton went first, summarizing Continental's position that the land claim was invalid and the marriage a fraud. Thornton followed, methodically dismantling each argument with evidence and testimony. Then the judge adjourned to consider his ruling. The wait was torture. Sarah and Silas sat in the courtroom with Ben and Martha, not speaking, just sitting. Other homesteaders lingered in the hallway, their fates tied to this decision even if their land wasn't directly at stake. If Continental won here, they'd win everywhere. An hour passed. Then another. Finally, the bailiff announced the judge's return. Everyone filed back in and stood as he entered. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked out over the silent courtroom. This court has considered the evidence and testimony presented by both parties, he began. The question before us is twofold. First, whether Mr. Kane's land claim is legitimate. Second, whether his marriage to Mrs. Kane is valid under territorial law. He paused, and Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. On the matter of the land claim, the evidence is clear. Mr. Kane's deed is properly recorded and has been recognized for 8 years without challenge. Continental surveys, while professionally conducted, rely on a fundamental error in identifying Copper Creek's location. The court finds that Mr. Kane's boundaries are accurate and his claim is valid. Relief flooded through Sarah, but the judge wasn't finished. On the matter of the marriage, the court acknowledges that the circumstances were unusual. However, unusual is not the same as invalid. Mrs. Kane testified credibly that she entered the arrangement voluntarily and has remained voluntarily. The marriage has been consummated, maintained, and by all evidence represents a genuine partnership between two consenting adults. He looked directly at Sarah and Silas. The court finds no evidence of coercion or fraud. The marriage is legitimate. Sarah's breath left her in a rush. Therefore, the judge concluded, the court rules in favor of the defendant on all counts. Continental Development's claim is dismissed. Mr. Kane's ownership of the disputed property is affirmed. Case closed. The gavel fell. For a moment, no one moved. Then the courtroom erupted. Homesteaders cheered, shaking hands, embracing. Ben clapped Silas on the back. Martha pulled Sarah into a fierce hug. Across the room, Continental's lawyers gathered their papers in tight-lipped silence. Hastings stood and walked out without looking back. And in the corner, Jacob Brennan sat alone, watching his daughter celebrate with the people who'd become her family. Sarah caught his eye one last time. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She just looked at him until he looked away. And then she turned back to Silas, who was watching her with something like wonder in his eyes. "We won," she said. "You won," Silas corrected. "You stood up there and told the truth, and you won." "We won," Sarah repeated firmly. "Together." Silas pulled her into his arms right there in the courtroom, and Sarah held on to him, feeling the last piece of her old life fall away. She wasn't Jacob Brennan's disappointing daughter anymore. Wasn't the woman nobody wanted. She was Sarah Kane, partner to a good man, defender of her own home, and strong enough to stand before power and speak her truth. They left the courthouse together, walking out into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it had any right to be in late winter. The homesteaders followed, talking excitedly about the precedent this set, about how they could use this victory to defend their own claims. Ben organized a celebration at his ranch that evening. People brought food, music, stories. Sarah found herself surrounded by women who asked her questions about the homestead, about managing livestock, about surviving mountain winters. They treated her as an equal, someone worth knowing. Late in the evening, as the celebration wound down, Sarah stepped outside for air. She stood on Ben's porch, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright, and felt a presence beside her. Grace. Her sister stood there, wrapped in a fine shawl, looking uncertain. "Grace," Sarah breathed. "Thomas brought me. He said I should see you, that you'd want to know I was all right." Grace twisted her hands together. "I'm sorry I didn't come to the trial. I was afraid." "It's all right." "No, it's not. You're my sister, and I should have been there." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I heard what you said, about choosing your life, about being free, and I realized I've never been that brave." Sarah took her sister's hands. "You're braver than you think." "I'm not. I just go along with whatever people tell me to do. I always have." "Then stop." Sarah squeezed her hands. "Grace, you have a choice now too. Thomas is a good man. I can see that. But if you're not happy, if you want something different, you can choose it. You don't have to stay somewhere you don't want to be." Grace looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in her expression. "I think I want to stay. Not because I'm trapped, but because Thomas is kind and patient, and he's teaching me to read ledgers, to help with the ranch accounts. He says I'm good at it." "Then stay," Sarah said. "But stay because you choose to." Grace nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will." She smiled through her tears. "You look different, stronger. I feel different." "Happy?" "Yes," Sarah said, and meant it. "I'm happy." They embraced, and when they pulled apart, Grace said, "Father's leaving. He told Thomas he's heading east, trying to start over somewhere else." "Good," Sarah said simply. "You don't want to see him? Say goodbye?" "No, he made his choices. I made mine. We're done." Grace nodded, understanding. They talked for a while longer, making tentative plans to visit each other when the weather improved, to write more often, to maintain the connection that had nearly been severed by their father's choices. When Grace left with Thomas, Sarah returned to the celebration. She found Silas standing with a group of men, discussing spring planting and water rights, and when he saw her, he excused himself and came to her side. "You all right?" he asked. "Better than all right." Sarah leaned against him, letting his arm come around her shoulders. "Ready to go home?" "Yeah, I think I am." They said their goodbyes, thanked Ben and Martha for everything, and climbed onto their wagon. The ride back up the mountain was quiet, peaceful. The stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Sarah leaned against Silas's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of the wagon beneath them. They'd fought, and they'd won. Not just the land, but something bigger. The right to choose their own lives. The right to build something together on their own terms. When they finally reached the cabin, Silas helped her down and they stood for a moment looking at their home. Smoke still rose from the chimney. They'd banked the fire before leaving, and it had kept. The horses nickered softly in the barn. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. "Thank you," Silas said quietly. "For what?" "For fighting. For staying. For choosing this." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Thank you for giving me something worth choosing." He kissed her then, soft and careful, and Sarah kissed him back. They held each other in the snow under the stars, and Sarah felt something settle deep in her bones. This was home. This was family. This was everything she'd never dared to hope for, earned through courage and truth, and the simple act of refusing to accept what the world said she deserved. They went inside together, closed the door against the cold, and began the rest of their lives. Spring came to the mountains like a slow exhale, the snow retreating inch by inch up the slopes until green emerged beneath. Sarah stood in the doorway of the cabin one morning in early April, watching meltwater run in silver ribbons down the hillside, and felt something shift inside her chest. The land was waking up, and so was she. Behind her, Silas moved through the cabin, making coffee the way he did every morning, methodical, quiet, a ritual that had become as familiar as breathing. Sarah turned and watched him work. This man who'd become her husband in every way that mattered. The legal victory had been months ago now, but the real victory was this, the life they'd built in the space between that courtroom and this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked, glancing up from the stove. "How different everything looks now than it did in winter." He poured coffee into 2 cups and brought one to her. "Better or worse?" "Just different. New." She took the cup, their fingers brushing. "I was thinking we should plant a garden this year. A real one, not just the herbs you've been keeping." Silas looked surprised. "You know how to garden?" "My mother taught me. Before she died, we had a plot behind whatever house we were renting. Tomatoes, beans, squash. She said growing your own food was the closest thing to freedom a woman could have." "Then we'll plant one," Silas said simply. "Whatever you want." Sarah smiled and sipped her coffee, looking out at the land that was theirs now, truly theirs. Continental had withdrawn all claims after the trial, though rumor had it they'd simply moved their attention to territories further west. The homesteaders who'd stood together had formed a loose alliance, sharing resources and information, watching each other's backs. Ben Patterson had become something of an unofficial leader, and Sarah and Silas were part of it now, part of a community instead of isolated and alone. That afternoon, Sarah walked down to the creek that marked their eastern boundary. Copper Creek, the one Continental had tried to claim, didn't exist where it did. The water ran high with snowmelt, cold and clear, and Sarah knelt beside it, pressing her palm to the muddy bank. This was the line they'd fought for. The proof that their home was real, legitimate, earned. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Silas approaching, carrying a wooden post over his shoulder. "What's that for?" she asked. "Boundary marker. Figured we should put one here, make it official." He set the post down and pulled out the tools he'd brought, a mallet, stakes. "Help me?" They worked together in the afternoon sun, driving the post deep into the ground beside the creek. When it was secure, Silas pulled out a knife and began carving something into the wood. Sarah watched as letters took shape. Cain. And below it, the year. "There," Silas said, stepping back. "Now everyone knows." Sarah traced the letters with her fingertips. Kane. Her name now. A name she'd earned, not inherited. It's perfect. They walked back to the cabin together as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The land stretched around them in shades of gold and green, and Sarah felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. Not rescue, not even love exactly, but belonging. The sense that she fit somewhere, that her presence mattered. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Silas said, "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." Sarah looked up from the mending in her lap. "What is it?" "In the fall, Ben's organizing a barn raising for the Hendersons, the family that came back after Continental left. They'll need help rebuilding. I said we'd be there." "Of course." "It'll be 3, maybe 4 days of work. We'd stay at Ben's place, come back when it's done." Sarah set down her sewing. "Silas, you don't have to ask my permission for things like this. This is your home too. If you want to help the Hendersons, we help them." "Our home," he corrected gently. "And I'm not asking permission. I'm asking if you want to go, if you're comfortable being around that many people for that long." Sarah thought about it. A year ago, the idea would have terrified her. All those eyes, all that judgment. But she wasn't the same woman who'd left that saloon wrapped in borrowed warmth and shame. She'd stood in a courtroom and defended her own life. She'd made friends, built connections. She belonged now. "I want to go," she said. "It'll be good to help, and Martha's been teaching me to quilt. Maybe I can contribute something for their home." Silas smiled, and Sarah realized how much she loved seeing that expression on his face. How rare it had been when they'd first met. How natural it was becoming now. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm that felt almost sacred in its ordinariness. Sarah planted her garden with seeds Martha had given her, working the soil until her back ached and her hands were black with earth. Silas repaired the barn roof and reinforced the corral, preparing for the foals that would come in summer. They worked side by side more often than not, talking when they felt like it, comfortable in silence when they didn't. One morning in late May, Sarah woke to find Silas already gone. She dressed and went outside to find him standing near the tree line, looking south toward the valley. She joined him, following his gaze to where a thin column of smoke rose against the pale sky. "Someone's burning," she said. "Yeah, Henderson Place looks like." Sarah's stomach tightened. "You think it's trouble?" "Don't know, but I'm going to check." He looked at her. "You should stay here." "Not a chance." Silas opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. "All right, but we go armed, and we're careful." They saddled 2 horses and rode down together, rifles secured to their saddles. As they descended, the smoke grew thicker, darker. By the time they reached the valley floor, Sarah could smell it. Not the clean scent of a cooking fire, but something acrid, chemical. The Henderson place came into view, and Sarah's breath caught. The barn was ablaze, flames tearing through the wooden structure with terrifying speed. People were running, neighbors, she realized, already there, forming bucket lines from the well to the fire. But it was clear the barn was lost. They were just trying to keep the flames from spreading to the house. Silas and Sarah dismounted and ran to help. Sarah joined the bucket line, passing water hand to hand while heat from the fire scorched her face and arms. The work was brutal, exhausting, and seemed endless. But slowly, gradually, they gained ground. The house was saved. The barn collapsed into itself with a roar of sparks and smoke, but nothing else caught. When it was finally over, everyone stood in the yard, blackened and exhausted, staring at the smoking ruins. Thomas Henderson, a young man with 2 small children, looked devastated. "What happened?" Ben asked, arriving with Martha and several other neighbors. "I don't know," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I woke up and it was already burning. Horses got out, thank mercy, but everything else—" He gestured helplessly at the wreckage. Silas was walking the perimeter, studying the ground. Sarah watched him crouch near what had been the barn's entrance, examining something. He straightened and beckoned to Ben. "What is it?" Ben asked. Silas pointed to marks in the dirt. Boot prints. Too many to belong to the family. And something else. A broken bottle that smelled of kerosene. "This wasn't an accident," Silas said quietly. The words fell like stones. People looked at each other, fear and anger mixing in their expressions. "Who would do this?" Martha asked. "Someone who wants us scared," Ben said grimly. "Someone who wants us to give up and leave." "Continental's gone," Thomas protested. "The judge ruled against them." "Continental's gone," Silas agreed. "But their money's still here, and people who take money don't like losing." Over the next hour, the truth emerged in pieces. 3 other homesteads had experienced problems in the past 2 weeks. Vandalized fences, poisoned wells, equipment damaged. Nobody had connected them until now, but the pattern was clear. Someone was trying to drive people out through fear and sabotage. "We need the marshal," Mrs. Gentry said. She'd come with her husband to help fight the fire. "The marshal's 3 days' ride away," Ben said. "By the time he gets here, who knows what else will happen?" "Then what do we do?" Thomas asked. Sarah stepped forward. "We do what we did before. We stand together. We watch each other's property. We don't let fear drive us out." "She's right," Silas said. "They're counting on us being isolated, picking us off one at a time, so we stop being isolated." Ben nodded slowly. "We organize patrols. 2 men, armed, riding the boundary properties every night. We rotate so everyone shares the burden." "And during the day?" someone asked. "During the day we rebuild," Sarah said. She looked at Thomas. "We'll help you raise a new barn, better than the one you lost. We'll make it clear that burning us out won't work." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Martha interrupted. "We're offering. That's what neighbors do." The decision was made. Patrols began that night, with Silas taking the first shift alongside Ben. Sarah stayed at the Henderson place with Martha and other women, helping to sort through what could be salvaged, watching the children while their parents tried to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, wagons began arriving. Lumber, tools, willing hands. The barn raising that had been planned for fall was happening now, driven by necessity and anger and stubborn determination. Sarah worked alongside the other women, preparing food, organizing supplies, keeping everything running while the men framed walls and raised beams. On the 3rd day, riders appeared on the horizon. Sarah saw them first and called out a warning. Everyone stopped work, hands moving to weapons. But as the riders got closer, Sarah recognized them. Thomas Whitmore and Grace, along with 3 ranch hands. Grace dismounted and ran to Sarah, embracing her. "We heard what happened. Thomas brought extra lumber and food. We want to help." Sarah pulled back, looking at her sister. Grace looked different, more confident, more settled. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Yes, we did. Your family." Grace smiled. "And besides, I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people fight my battles." The Whitmore ranch hands joined the work, and with their help, the barn's frame went up faster. By the 4th evening, it stood skeletal but strong against the darkening sky. Thomas Henderson stood looking at it, his children beside him, and wept. That night, as the patrols rode out and people settled in for rest, something happened that changed everything. 2 riders came in hard from the north, shouting for Ben. Sarah and Silas ran out to meet them. "We caught them," one of the riders said, breathing hard. 2 men, trying to sabotage the Morrison water line. We've got them tied up at Ben's place." Everyone converged on the Patterson ranch. In the barn, tied to posts and looking significantly worse for wear, sat 2 men Sarah had never seen before. Ben stood over them, his expression thunderous. "Who are you?" he demanded. The men said nothing. "I'll ask once more. Who hired you?" Still silence. Silas stepped forward, and something in his face made both men flinch. "You can talk to us, or you can talk to the territorial marshal when he gets here. Your choice. But either way, you're talking." The younger man broke first. "We were just supposed to scare people, make them think staying wasn't worth it." "Who hired you?" "Man named Dalton, lawyer from the Continental case. Said the company was gone, but he still had investors who wanted the land. Offered us good money to convince folks to leave." Sarah felt cold fury wash through her. Dalton, Continental's lead attorney. He'd lost in court, so he'd turned to intimidation and violence instead. "Where is he?" Ben asked. "Hotel in town. Far as I know, he's still there." Ben looked at Silas, then at Sarah. "We take this to the marshal, proper channels. We do this right." "No," Sarah said. Everyone turned to look at her. We do this right, yes, but we don't wait for the marshal. We go to town. We confront Dalton, and we make sure everyone there knows what he's been doing. That's dangerous, Martha said. So is waiting. Sarah met Ben's eyes. He's counting on us being afraid to act, afraid to make noise. So we make noise. We bring these two men, we bring witnesses, and we make Dalton answer for what he's done. She's right, Silas said quietly. Ben was silent for a long moment, then nodded. We ride at dawn. Everyone who can spare a day. We make this public. They rode into town the next morning, 20 strong, homesteaders and ranchers, men and women, with the two captured saboteurs tied in a wagon. People came out to watch the procession, whispers spreading through the streets. Sarah rode beside Silas, her back straight, her chin high. She remembered the last time she'd come through these streets, wrapped in shame, barely existing. Now she rode as herself, surrounded by people who respected her, fighting for something that mattered. They stopped in front of the hotel. Ben and Silas went inside while the others waited, the crowd in the street growing larger, more curious. Dalton emerged 5 minutes later, looking furious but controlled. What is the meaning of this? The meaning, Ben said loudly for the crowd's benefit, is that we caught 2 men trying to sabotage homesteads, men who say you hired them. That's preposterous.
I'm an attorney, not a... We have witnesses, Sarah interrupted, stepping forward. And we have evidence. You lost in court, Mr. Dalton, so you decided to win through fear instead. Dalton's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Kane, I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Can't I? Sarah pulled out a piece of paper, a receipt one of the captured men had been carrying, showing payment from an account linked to Dalton's firm. Thornton had helped her understand how to read it, what it proved. This shows money paid to these men from an account you control, and they're willing to testify that you hired them specifically to drive homesteaders off their land. The crowd murmured. Dalton's face went pale. You're finished here, Ben said. The marshal's already been notified. He'll be here within the week. You can wait for him if you like, but I suspect you'd rather leave on your own terms. This is harassment, Dalton said, but his voice lacked conviction. This is justice, Sarah said. Something you tried to deny us in that courtroom and failed. So you turned to violence, but we're still here, Mr. Dalton, and we're not going anywhere. Dalton looked around at the faces surrounding him. Homesteaders he'd tried to break, townspeople who'd witnessed Continental's tactics. He saw his defeat in their eyes. This isn't over, he said. Yes, it is, Silas said quietly. Leave, today, and don't come back. Dalton turned and went back into the hotel. Within an hour, he'd checked out and ridden south. The 2 captured men were turned over to the local sheriff to hold until the marshal arrived. The homesteaders returned to the valley victorious, but Sarah knew the real victory wasn't in defeating Dalton. It was in what they'd proven to themselves, that they could stand together, that they could fight back, that they were stronger than the forces trying to break them. The barn raising continued. By the end of the following week, Thomas Henderson had a new barn, larger than his old one, sturdier, built by hands that refused to be intimidated. A celebration followed, with food and music and children running wild in the early summer evening. Sarah sat with Grace under the stars, watching Silas talk with Ben and Thomas near the fire. You look happy, Grace said. I am. I never thought I'd see you like this. When we were growing up, you always seemed so heavy, like you were carrying weight nobody else could see. I was. Sarah looked at her sister. Are you happy, Grace? Grace thought for a moment. I think I'm learning how to be. Thomas is patient with me. He doesn't expect me to be anything other than what I am. And he's teaching me things, how to manage accounts, how to read legal documents. He says I'm good at it. She smiled. Nobody ever told me I was good at anything before. You were always good at things. Father just never let you see it. Father's gone, Grace said. Thomas heard he made it to Chicago, found work in a factory. I don't think we'll hear from him again. Good, Sarah said, and found she meant it. Her father was a chapter closed, a debt paid. She owed him nothing now. The summer passed in a blur of work and growth. Sarah's garden flourished, producing more vegetables than she and Silas could use. She traded the surplus with neighbors, built up stores for winter, learned to can and preserve.
Silas took on hired work helping other homesteaders, and the money they earned went toward improvements: a new plow, glass for the windows, a cow that would provide milk and eventually calves. They worked hard, but they also learned to rest. Sunday afternoons became their time together, when they'd walk the land or sit by the creek or simply exist in each other's presence. Sarah learned the contours of Silas's silences, could read his moods in the set of his shoulders or the way he held his coffee cup. And Silas learned to recognize when Sarah needed to talk and when she needed to think, when to offer comfort and when to offer space. In August, Martha came up the mountain with news. She was pregnant, due in the spring. Sarah embraced her friend, feeling a joy that was only slightly tinged with envy. She and Silas hadn't talked about children, weren't sure if they wanted them. But the possibility existed now in a way it never had before. They had a home, a life, stability. They could choose. That evening, Sarah mentioned Martha's news to Silas. "That's good," he said. "Ben will make a good father." "Would you? Want to be a father, I mean?" Silas set down the piece of harness he'd been mending. "I was a father once, lost him before he could walk." "I know. I'm sorry." "It doesn't mean I wouldn't want to be one again." He looked at her. "Is that something you're thinking about?" "I don't know. Maybe. Not yet, but someday." "Someday sounds good to me." They left it at that, but Sarah felt something settle, another piece of their shared future clicking into place. They had time. They had choice. They had each other. As autumn arrived, painting the mountains in impossible colors, the community gathered for a harvest celebration at Ben's ranch. The homesteaders who'd fought together, who'd stood against intimidation and won, came together to mark the season's end. There was food, music, dancing. Children ran wild while adults talked and laughed and remembered. Sarah found herself dancing with Silas, awkward at first, neither of them natural at it, but laughing as they stumbled through the steps. Looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight, Sarah felt overwhelmed by gratitude. These people had become her family. This place had become her home. Later, as the celebration wound down and people began drifting toward wagons and horses, Thomas Henderson approached Sarah and Silas. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "both of you, for everything you did. The barn, yes, but more than that, for showing me what it means to stand firm." "We just did what needed doing," Silas said. "No, it was more than that." Thomas looked at Sarah. "You stood up in that courtroom and told your truth when everyone expected you to fold. That gave the rest of us courage, made us realize we could fight too." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "We all fought, together. That's what made the difference." Thomas nodded and moved on, but his words stayed with Sarah through the ride home, through the evening as she and Silas settled in for the night. She'd spent so much of her life believing she was worthless, that her only value was in being useful to others. But she'd learned something different here, that her worth was inherent, that choosing herself wasn't selfish, that being strong didn't mean never needing help. Winter came again, but this time Sarah greeted it without fear. She'd survived one mountain winter and knew she could survive another. The cabin was well stocked, the animals prepared, the work divided between herself and Silas in ways that felt natural, balanced. On a snowy evening in December, almost exactly a year after that first night in the cabin, Sarah and Silas sat by the fire. She was reading aloud from a book Ben had lent them while Silas worked on carving a set of spoons for Martha's baby. The fire crackled, wind howled outside, and in the warmth and safety of their home, Sarah paused mid-sentence and looked at her husband. "Silas?" He looked up. "Yeah? I love you." It wasn't the first time she'd said it, but it still made him smile, that rare, precious expression that transformed his scarred face into something beautiful. "I love you too," he said. Sarah returned to her reading, but the words blurred on the page. She was crying, she realized. Not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming fullness of having everything she'd never known she could have. Spring came again, bringing Martha's baby, a healthy girl they named Sarah, who squalled with impressive volume and made everyone smile. Sarah held her namesake and felt that possibility again, that maybe someday she and Silas would add to their family. But not yet. For now, it was enough to be aunt to this child, friend to these people, partner to this man. The land continued its cycles. The homesteaders continued their alliance, stronger now for what they'd survived together. Continental never returned, and Dalton was reportedly practicing law in San Francisco, far from the territories he'd tried to steal. The marshal had come, investigated, and closed the case with a warning to anyone else who might try similar tactics. And Sarah continued to grow into herself, the woman she'd always had the potential to be but never had the space to become. She learned to use a rifle well enough to hunt alongside Silas. She became known throughout the valley as someone who could birth livestock, set a broken bone, and negotiate fair trades. She wrote letters for those who couldn't write themselves and read contracts for those who didn't trust the fine print. One afternoon in late spring of their 3rd year together, Sarah rode down to town for supplies. She was alone. Silas was working on an addition to the cabin, building a separate room that could serve as a nursery someday, or just as space for themselves. As Sarah tied her horse outside the general store, she saw a young woman sitting on the steps, looking lost and frightened. Sarah recognized that expression. She'd worn it herself once. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked. The woman looked up, barely 20, with a bruise yellowing on her cheek and clothes that had seen better days. "I'm fine." "No, you're not. And that's all right. But if you need help, I don't have any money." "I didn't ask if you had money. I asked if you needed help." The woman's face crumpled. "My husband, he drinks, gets mean. I tried to leave, but I don't have anywhere to go. No family, no... There's a ranch about 10 miles south of here, Patterson Place. You tell Ben and Martha that Sarah Kane sent you. Tell them you need work and a safe place to stay. They'll help you." Why would they do that for a stranger? Sarah thought about a scarred man walking into a saloon and offering freedom to someone who'd never known it. She thought about communities built on mutual support instead of mutual fear. She thought about how many times she'd been helped when she had nothing to offer in return. "Because that's what people do," Sarah said simply. "When they're good people. And Ben and Martha are good people." She gave the woman directions, pressed a little money into her hand despite protests, and watched her ride south toward the Patterson Ranch. Sarah didn't know if the woman would make it, didn't know if she'd find the courage to leave her situation for good. But she'd been given a choice, and that was something. That evening, Sarah told Silas about the encounter. "You think she'll go?" he asked. "I don't know. I hope so." "You did good, sending her to Ben's." "I just did what you did for me. Gave her an option." Silas pulled her close, and they stood together watching the sun set over their land. The addition was taking shape. 4 walls, a roof partially framed. It would be done by summer, Silas said, ready for whatever they decided to fill it with. "I've been thinking," Sarah said. "About?" "About us. About starting a family." Silas was quiet, his arms tightening around her. "Yeah? I'm not scared anymore. Of the future, of what might happen. I think I'm ready." "Are you sure?" Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "I'm sure. We've built something real here, Silas, something strong, and I want to share it. I want to bring a child into this home and show them what it means to be loved, to be safe, to have choices." Silas kissed her, slow and deep, and Sarah kissed him back with everything she had. They went inside as the last light faded from the sky, and in the warmth of their cabin, they chose their future together. The years that followed brought changes, as years do. A daughter arrived in the winter of their 4th year together, a small, fierce thing they named Eleanor after Sarah's mother. She had Silas's dark hair and Sarah's determination, and from the moment she drew her first breath, she owned them completely. Grace and Thomas had children too, and the cousins grew up riding between properties, learning the land together. The Homesteader Alliance evolved into a genuine community with shared schools and shared resources and shared celebrations. Ben became something of a local leader, and Martha's organizational skills kept everyone coordinated. Silas never became talkative, but he became known as someone whose word could be trusted absolutely, whose judgment was sound, whose door was open to anyone who needed help. And Sarah became the woman people came to when they needed someone to speak truth, to stand firm, to fight for what was right. Continental's defeat became local legend, the story of how a community stood together against corporate greed and won. And at the center of that story, whether Sarah liked it or not, was the tale of a woman who'd been sold in a saloon and ended up helping save an entire valley. But Sarah didn't think of herself as heroic. She thought of herself as someone who'd been given a chance and taken it, who'd been offered dignity and grown into it, who'd found love in the unlikeliest of places and built a life worthy of it. On a summer evening, 10 years after that first night in the cabin, Sarah stood outside watching Eleanor and her younger brother, a boy named Thomas, born 2 years after his sister, chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Silas came out to join her, gray threading through his dark hair now, the scar on his face faded with time but never quite gone. "You ever think about that night?" Sarah asked. "In the saloon?" "Sometimes." "Do you regret it?" Silas looked at her like she'd asked if the sky was made of stone. "Not even for a second. You?" Sarah thought about the woman she'd been, afraid, ashamed, certain of her own worthlessness. She thought about the journey from that moment to this one, about everything she'd learned and fought for and become. "No," she said. "I don't regret it at all." Eleanor ran up, breathless and laughing, holding a firefly cupped carefully in her hands. "Mama, look!" Sarah knelt down to see, and the insect glowed against her daughter's palms. Tiny, perfect, miraculous. "Beautiful, sweet girl. Now let it go." Eleanor opened her hands, and the firefly rose into the darkening air, joining the constellation of lights dancing across their land. The girl ran off again, and Silas pulled Sarah to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's get them inside before full dark." They called the children in together, and as they settled around the table for a late supper, Sarah looked at the faces illuminated by lamplight. Her husband, her children, the home they'd built together, and felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. This was the life she'd chosen. This was the family she'd made. This was the future she'd fought for. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Outside, the mountain stood eternal against the stars, and somewhere in the darkness, other lives were unfolding, other choices being made, other futures being built. But in this cabin, on this land, Sarah Kane, once Sarah Brennan, once the daughter nobody wanted, was exactly where she belonged. She was home.